January 15, 1968, dawned hot and merciless over Bien Hoa Air Base, and Specialist 4 Ronald Doc Patterson gripped the M60 machine gun mounted to the side of his UH-1 Huey helicopter, watching the jungle canopy blur beneath him at 120 knots. At 19 years old, he had just volunteered for what military statisticians would later calculate as the most dangerous job in the most dangerous war America had fought since the Second World War: the helicopter door gunner. Average life expectancy in combat 19 seconds. The statistic wasn't official military doctrine, but it spread through the ranks like gospel truth, whispered in barracks and mess halls from Da Nang to the Mekong Delta. Whether precisely accurate or battlefield legend, the number reflected a terrifying reality that every door gunner understood the moment they strapped into their canvas seat with nothing but open air between them and the enemy below. Patterson hadn't planned on this assignment. Like most young men drafted or enlisted between 1965 and 1973, he'd been swept into the machinery of war with little say in his destination. He'd arrived in Vietnam in December of 1967 as a helicopter crew chief, maintaining the Hueys that served as the war's workhorses. But the Army needed door gunners desperately. The helicopter assault tactics that defined Vietnam required 2 gunners per aircraft, 1 on each side, and the casualty rates created constant vacancies. The role itself was brutally simple. Strapped loosely to the aircraft with a monkey harness, the door gunner sat in the open doorway of the Huey, exposed to the elements and enemy fire, operating an M60 machine gun or sometimes a .50 caliber weapon. Their mission was to provide suppressive fire during insertions and extractions, protect the aircraft from ground attack, and engage enemy forces that threatened the helicopter or the soldiers it carried. According to military records referenced in the book Chicken Hawk by Robert Mason, a former Huey pilot, door gunners fired more ammunition than almost any other combat position in Vietnam, sometimes expending thousands of rounds in a single day. The Huey itself, officially designated the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, became the symbol of the Vietnam War. Its distinctive whop-whop-whop rotor sound announced American presence across the countryside. By 1968, over 2,000 Hueys operated in Vietnam, conducting combat assaults, medical evacuations, supply missions, and reconnaissance. Each required a crew of 4: pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and door gunner. The door gunner position, however, remained the most exposed, the most vulnerable, and the most consistently deadly. Patterson learned quickly that the 19-second calculation referred specifically to hot landing zones, when helicopters descended into clearings or rice paddies, while enemy forces poured automatic weapons fire and rocket-propelled grenades toward them. During those terrible moments when the aircraft slowed and descended, becoming an enormous hovering target, door gunners earned their grim reputation. They stood between the enemy and everyone aboard, firing continuously, often while taking direct fire themselves. The young specialist from Ohio hadn't told his mother what his new assignment meant when he'd written home last week. 3 months earlier, in October of 1967, Patterson had stood in the humid afternoon heat at Fort Rucker, Alabama, watching instructors demonstrate the M60 machine gun that would become his constant companion. The training lasted only 2 weeks, barely enough time to teach the mechanical basics, let alone prepare someone psychologically for what awaited in Southeast Asia. The M60, introduced in 1957, weighed 23 pounds and fired 700 rounds per minute. Gas-operated and belt-fed, it could sustain fire longer than its predecessor weapons, though it frequently jammed, especially in Vietnam's dust, humidity, and combat conditions. Door gunners learned to clear jams in seconds, often while taking fire, because hesitation meant death for themselves and everyone aboard the helicopter. Sergeant First Class Marcus Williams, a door gunner instructor who'd completed his first Vietnam tour in 1966, delivered the training with brutal honesty. He'd lost 3 members of his original crew to enemy fire and didn't believe in sugarcoating reality for the young men passing through his classes. Williams told them about the particular vulnerability of helicopters, how the thin aluminum skin provided no protection against rifle rounds, how the fuel tanks could ignite from tracer fire, how the hydraulics could fail instantly when struck, sending the aircraft into uncontrolled spins toward the jungle below. The training emphasized immediate action drills. Mount the weapon. Load. Fire. Clear jams. Reload. Adjust fire. Communicate with the pilot through the intercom system. Identify threats. Engage. Survive. The instructors stressed that door gunners needed to think in 3 dimensions simultaneously, watching the landing zone, monitoring their weapons function, tracking the aircraft's position, scanning for enemy positions, coordinating with the other gunner, and listening to pilot commands through headsets often barely audible over rotor noise and weapons fire. Physical conditioning formed another crucial component. Door gunners needed upper body strength to control the bucking M60 during sustained fire, core strength to maintain balance in the open doorway during violent evasive maneuvers, and endurance to function during missions that could last 12 hours in 100-degree heat with minimal breaks. They practiced hanging from the aircraft simulator while it tilted and jerked, learning to fire accurately while experiencing the physical chaos of combat flight. Patterson excelled at marksmanship but struggled with the psychological aspects. The instructors showed films from Vietnam, actual combat footage that captured helicopter assaults with brutal clarity. He watched door gunners firing into tree lines, saw tracers arcing up from the ground like deadly fireflies, witnessed aircraft taking hits and struggling to maintain altitude. One clip showed a door gunner slumped over his weapon after being struck, the helicopter banking hard to escape the kill zone while the surviving gunner continued firing from the opposite side. The most disturbing lesson came during night training. Williams explained that door gunners often couldn't see what they were shooting at. They fired into muzzle flashes, into suspected enemy positions marked by pilots, into tree lines and villages where intelligence suggested Viet Cong presence. The moral ambiguity of this troubled Patterson deeply, but Williams offered no comfort. War wasn't clean, he said, and Vietnam was particularly dirty. Door gunners who hesitated died, and they took their crews with them. According to the book 100 Feet Over Hell by Jim Hooper, which chronicles helicopter warfare in Vietnam and serves as a reference for understanding these operations, door gunners received minimal psychological preparation for what they would experience. The military assumed young men could adapt to combat through exposure, a theory that proved tragically flawed for many veterans who carried psychological wounds home alongside physical ones. Patterson graduated from the abbreviated training in late October and received orders for Vietnam. December 2, 1967 marked Patterson's first day in the Republic of Vietnam, and the heat struck him like a physical blow when the transport aircraft door opened at Tan Son Nut Air Base near Saigon. The air smelled of jet fuel, human waste, cooking fires, and something else he couldn't identify but would later recognize as the distinctive scent of a war zone, a mixture of fear, sweat, and death that permeated everything. The 90th Assault Helicopter Company, call sign Undertakers, would be his home for the next 12 months, assuming he survived that long. Located at Bien Hoa Air Base 15 miles northeast of Saigon, the unit flew daily missions supporting Army operations throughout the 3-Corps Tactical Zone. The company operated 24 UH-1 helicopters divided into assault, lift, and gunship configurations. Patterson was assigned to an assault platoon that specialized in combat insertions and extractions, the missions that generated the highest casualty rates. His first night in country, Patterson lay awake on his bunk in the wooden hooch that housed the company's enlisted personnel, listening to distant artillery fire and trying to process the reality of where he was. The veterans around him slept soundly, accustomed to the sounds of war. One soldier, Specialist James Rodriguez from Texas, had been in country for 9 months and had stories that simultaneously terrified and fascinated the new arrivals. Rodriguez had been a door gunner for 7 months, an eternity in a job where most casualties occurred within the first 3 months or were wounded so severely they couldn't return to flight status. He'd survived because of skill, luck, and an almost supernatural awareness of danger that he'd developed after his first aircraft took heavy fire during an insertion near the Cambodian border. That day, February 9, 1967, Rodriguez's helicopter had been fourth in a flight of 8 Hueys carrying infantry into a hot LZ. The first 3 aircraft had landed without incident, but when Rodriguez's Huey descended, the tree line erupted with automatic weapons fire. The aircraft commander, Warrant Officer Thomas Blake, had continued the approach despite the fire, knowing the infantry needed to get on the ground quickly. Rodriguez engaged a machine gun position at the tree line's edge, firing in controlled bursts as he'd been trained, watching his tracers walk into the target. The enemy gun fell silent, but two others opened up from different positions. Rounds punched through the Huey's thin skin, one passing between Rodriguez's legs and exiting through the floor, another striking the crew chief on the opposite side in the shoulder. Blake had pulled up hard, abandoning the landing, and radioed for gunship support while climbing away from the kill zone. The crew chief, despite his wound, had continued firing until they reached altitude. Rodriguez had never felt fear like that before. The absolute helplessness of being shot at with no cover, no way to protect yourself except to shoot back and trust the pilots to get you out alive. He'd vomited after they landed at the nearest firebase, and Blake had told him that was normal, that anyone who wasn't scared was either lying or insane. Now Rodriguez shared his survival knowledge with Patterson during those first days. Always watch the tree lines. Learn to recognize muzzle flashes instantly. Fire where the pilot tells you, but trust your own eyes too. Keep your weapon maintained obsessively because jams will kill you. Don't think too much about the statistics or the danger because fear makes you stupid, and stupid gets you dead. Stay hydrated because the heat will drain you before the enemy even gets a chance. Most importantly, develop a rhythm with your crew, anticipate what they need, communicate constantly, become a team so tight you function as a single organism. January 7, 1968, Patterson flew his first combat mission, a routine morning insertion of infantry troops into a relatively secure area northwest of Bien Hoa. The briefing at 0500 hours indicated no enemy contact was expected, but in Vietnam, expectations meant little. The operations officer, Captain Robert Hayes, reminded everyone that routine missions could turn deadly in seconds, and complacency killed more soldiers than heroism saved. Patterson's aircraft commander was Warrant Officer John Eagle Hansen, a 22-year-old from Montana, who'd been flying combat missions for 8 months. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Michael Chen, was even newer to Vietnam than Patterson, having arrived just 3 weeks earlier. The crew chief, Specialist Terry Washington from Georgia, had 5 months in country and a calm demeanor that suggested competence and experience. The pre-flight began at 0530 with Washington and Patterson checking every inch of the aircraft. They examined the M60 mounts, loaded ammunition boxes with belts of 7.62mm rounds, tested the intercom system, checked the monkey harnesses that would keep them connected to the aircraft, verified the medical supplies stored behind the seats, and ensured the fire extinguisher was accessible. Washington worked with methodical precision, occasionally offering tips to Patterson about what to watch for, where problems typically occurred, how to position ammunition for quick access during combat. At 0600 hours, 8 helicopters lifted off from Bien Hoa in formation, their rotors creating a thunderous cacophony that shook the ground. Patterson sat in the right doorway, safety belt attached, M60 ready, watching the sun rise over the jungle as they climbed to 1,500 feet and turned northwest. The flight lasted 20 minutes, covering terrain that shifted from cultivated fields near the airbase to increasingly dense jungle. From altitude, Vietnam looked beautiful. Lush green vegetation, winding rivers, small villages with rice paddies arranged in geometric patterns. The beauty concealed the war's reality. Hansen's voice crackled through Patterson's headset. 5 minutes out, lock and load, stay sharp. Patterson charged his weapon, pulling back the bolt and chambering the first round, setting the safety off. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Washington, on the opposite side, appeared relaxed, already scanning the approaching landing zone with professional focus. The formation descended rapidly, dropping from 1,500 feet to treetop level in what felt like seconds. Patterson's stomach lurched with the sudden altitude change. The helicopters flew fast and low now, making themselves difficult targets, approaching the LZ from the east with the morning sun behind them to blind any potential enemy gunners. The landing zone appeared ahead, a cleared area perhaps 100 meters across, surrounded by jungle. The lead helicopter flared hard, nose up, tail down, bleeding off speed as it descended toward the grass. The others followed in rapid succession. Patterson's Huey was number 6. As they descended, he scanned the tree line through his gun sight, searching for threats, seeing nothing but green vegetation and morning shadows. The infantry soldiers sitting behind him, 8 men from the 1st Infantry Division called the Big Red One, prepared to jump out the moment the skids touched ground. According to Hansen's later account recorded in the unit's daily journals, which provide historical documentation of these operations, the insertion went smoothly. All 8 helicopters landed, discharged their infantry passengers, and lifted off again within 90 seconds. No enemy fire, no casualties. A successful routine mission. For Patterson, it felt simultaneously anticlimactic and terrifying. He'd been so tense, so prepared for combat, that the absence of danger left him confused and exhausted. Back at Bien Hoa, Washington laughed at Patterson's expression and said, "Welcome to Vietnam, Cherry. Sometimes it's like that, sometimes it ain't." January 23, 1968, shattered Patterson's illusions about routine missions and safe insertions. The day began like any other, with early morning briefings, aircraft preparations, and the now familiar ritual of checking weapons and equipment. The mission involved extracting a reconnaissance team that had been operating near the Cambodian border for 5 days and had made contact with enemy forces. The team needed immediate extraction, and the undertakers drew the assignment. Captain Hayes delivered the briefing with unusual gravity. The reconnaissance team, call sign Apache 6, consisted of 6 Special Forces soldiers and 4 Montagnard scouts operating in an area known for heavy North Vietnamese Army presence. They'd been compromised during the night and were moving toward an emergency extraction point while being pursued by an enemy force of unknown size. The first helicopter attempting to extract them would almost certainly take fire. The gunships would prep the area, but everyone needed to expect a hot LZ. Patterson felt his breakfast threatening to reappear as he walked to the aircraft. This was it, the real thing. The situation where the 19-second life expectancy became more than a statistic. Hansen seemed tense, too, his usual casual demeanor replaced by focused intensity as he conducted the pre-flight checks. Chen, the co-pilot, was visibly nervous, and even Washington moved with more urgency than usual. The flight north took 40 minutes, skimming over jungle that grew increasingly mountainous and dense. They flew as a package, 4 assault Hueys, 2 gunships armed with rockets and miniguns, and a command and control helicopter orbiting at altitude. Radio chatter filled Patterson's headset as the reconnaissance team reported their position and the pursuing enemy force. Apache 6's team leader, a Green Beret sergeant named William Thompson, sounded calm despite the circumstances, providing precise coordinates and tactical information. The extraction point was a small clearing on a hillside, barely large enough for 1 helicopter. The gunships made their runs first, firing rockets into the surrounding jungle, the explosions sending columns of smoke and debris skyward. Patterson watched through his gun sight as the jungle seemed to explode, hoping the preparation would suppress any enemy gunners waiting to engage them. Hansen's Huey went in first. He descended fast, diving toward the clearing at a steep angle, flaring hard at the last moment. Patterson's world became chaos. The helicopter bucked and shuddered as Hansen fought the controls. The downwash from the rotors whipped vegetation in every direction. Through the swirling dust and leaves, Patterson saw figures running toward them from the tree line, friendly forces, the recon team. Then the enemy fire started. At first, Patterson didn't recognize it, sharp cracking sounds barely audible over the rotor noise. Then he saw muzzle flashes in the jungle, perhaps 50 meters away, and tracers arcing toward them. Washington opened fire immediately, his M60 hammering out rounds. Patterson hesitated for perhaps 2 seconds, frozen by the reality of people actually shooting at him. Then muscle memory took over. He swung his gun toward the muzzle flashes and squeezed the trigger. The M60 bucked in his hands, the sound deafening despite his helmet. He fired in bursts, watching his tracers disappear into the jungle, unable to tell if he was hitting anything. More enemy fire erupted from a different position. Rounds snapped past the open doorway, making sounds like angry hornets. One struck the helicopter's aluminum skin with a metallic ping that Patterson heard clearly despite the chaos. The recon team reached the helicopter. 10 men scrambling aboard while Patterson and Washington continued firing. One soldier appeared wounded, supported by 2 others. They threw themselves into the cargo area, piling in, and Thompson screamed, "Go! Go! Go!" into the intercom. Hansen pulled pitch, and the Huey staggered upward, overloaded, struggling to climb out of the clearing while enemy fire intensified. The helicopter shuddered violently as Hansen pushed the aircraft to its limits, trying to gain altitude while additional enemy fire erupted from multiple positions around the clearing. Patterson continued firing, no longer thinking, operating on pure instinct and adrenaline. His training had prepared him mechanically but not emotionally for this moment. The noise was overwhelming. Rotor blades thrashing the air, turbine engines screaming at full power, M60s hammering from both sides, rounds striking the aircraft, men shouting, and underneath it all his own heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. A round struck Patterson's M60, hitting the receiver and ricocheting away with a shower of sparks. The weapon fell silent. For a terrible moment, he thought he'd been hit, but the gun had simply jammed. His hands moved automatically through the immediate action drill. Pull the charging handle, inspect the chamber, clear the obstruction. A mangled cartridge fell away. He recharged the weapon and resumed firing as the helicopter finally cleared the tree line and began gaining altitude. Washington's voice came through the headset, steady despite the circumstances. "Crew chief to pilot, we took multiple hits checking for damage and casualties." Patterson glanced across the cargo area and saw Washington moving among the recon team members, assessing their condition. The wounded soldier was bleeding from his leg but conscious and talking. The others appeared unhurt, though all bore the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd been in sustained combat. As they climbed to 1,500 feet and turned south toward Bien Hoa, Patterson's shaking began. His hands trembled so badly he could barely hold his weapon. The fear he'd suppressed during the extraction now flooded through him. They'd been in the landing zone for perhaps 45 seconds, and during that time enemy soldiers had done everything possible to kill them. The thin aluminum skin of the helicopter had provided no real protection. Only speed, pilot skill, and suppressive fire from the door gunners had gotten them out alive. Hansen's voice, remarkably calm, came through the intercom. "Good work, crew. That was a hot one. Patterson, you did fine for your first time under fire." The words helped steady Patterson somewhat, though the shaking continued for another 10 minutes. He forced himself to conduct post-engagement checks on his weapon, clear it, safe it, and prepare for landing. Professional routine helped push back the terror. The flight back to Bien Hoa took 35 minutes. Patterson spent the time staring at the jungle below, processing what had just happened. He'd fired his weapon at other human beings. He might have killed someone. People had tried to kill him. The abstract concept of combat had become brutally, terrifyingly real. The 19-second life expectancy suddenly seemed optimistic rather than frightening. After landing, the maintenance crew swarmed over the helicopter, counting bullet holes. They found 17 strikes on the fuselage, including 2 through the transmission cowling that had somehow missed critical components, 1 through the pilot's windscreen between Hansen and Chen that neither had noticed during the flight, and the hit on Patterson's M60 that had caused the jam. According to military records, this level of battle damage was common for helicopter units in Vietnam, with some aircraft receiving over 100 hits during a single mission and still managing to fly home. Sergeant Thompson, the recon team leader, found Patterson after debriefing and shook his hand. The Green Beret's face was gaunt from days in the jungle, his uniform torn and filthy, but his eyes were clear and grateful. "Your fire suppression kept them from overrunning us during the extraction," Thompson said. "You saved our lives today." Patterson didn't know how to respond. He'd just been trying to survive, doing what his training demanded, and it had somehow been enough. That night, Patterson wrote a letter home to his mother in Ohio, but didn't mention what had happened. Instead, he wrote about the weather, the food, the other men in his unit, safe topics that wouldn't cause her to worry. January 30th, 1968 changed everything, though Patterson didn't understand the significance immediately. The Tet Offensive began with coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, including assaults on major cities, military installations, and even the American embassy in Saigon. The undertakers were scrambled before dawn, flying emergency missions to reinforce besieged positions, extract wounded personnel, and resupply units engaged in desperate fighting. Patterson flew 6 missions that day, each one a blur of chaos and violence. The first mission evacuated wounded soldiers from a fire base under mortar attack north of Saigon. Enemy fire was sporadic but deadly, and the helicopter in front of them took an RPG hit during the extraction, killing the entire crew instantly. Patterson watched the aircraft explode and fall from the sky, a sight that would haunt his dreams for decades. The second mission inserted reaction forces into Bien Hoa City itself, where Viet Cong sappers had penetrated the airbase perimeter. Flying over the base they'd departed from just hours earlier, Patterson saw explosions, burning buildings, and firefights scattered across the installation. The surreal experience of fighting to retake their own base drove home how completely the enemy's surprise attack had upended the war's normal patterns. By the third mission, Patterson had stopped counting rounds fired or enemy positions engaged. His world shrank to a simple cycle. Load ammunition, fire at threats, clear jams, reload, fire again. Washington remained steady throughout, coordinating their fire, communicating with Hansen, keeping Patterson focused. The crew chief's experience and calm demeanor literally kept Patterson alive that day, as the young door gunner was operating beyond his training and experience level. The fourth mission involved extracting American advisors and their Vietnamese counterparts from a compound in Long Binh, being overrun by enemy forces. The landing zone was a parking lot surrounded by buildings, with enemy forces in adjacent structures firing down at the helicopters. It was the most intense combat Patterson would experience during his entire tour. The extraction helicopter ahead of theirs crashed during landing after its tail rotor was shot off, blocking half the available space and killing 3 crew members. Hansen somehow threaded their Huey into the remaining space while Patterson and Washington poured fire into the surrounding buildings. The advisors and Vietnamese soldiers ran to the aircraft through a gauntlet of enemy fire. One man fell meters from the helicopter, struck multiple times. A Marine advisor jumped out, grabbed the wounded man, and dragged him aboard while Patterson continued firing. The helicopter lifted off with 13 people crammed into a space designed for 8, skids barely clearing the crashed helicopter, climbing away through a storm of tracer fire. The fifth mission extracted more wounded from another besieged position. By this point, Patterson was operating on autopilot, exhausted beyond anything he'd imagined possible. His shoulders ached from controlling the M60, his ears rang despite hearing protection, his throat was raw from the dry air and gun smoke, and his mind felt detached from his body. He continued functioning because stopping wasn't an option and men needed saving. The sixth mission, flown after dark using only instrument lights and occasional flares, brought supplies and ammunition to a special forces camp that was nearly out of both and surrounded by enemy forces. According to accounts documented in the book Vietnam Choppers by Philip D. Chinnery, which provides detailed information about helicopter operations during the Tet Offensive, night resupply missions were among the most dangerous because pilots had to navigate using minimal lighting, while enemy gunners could see the helicopter silhouetted against the sky and had ample time to aim. Patterson and Washington took turns sleeping during the brief intervals between missions, 20-minute naps on the ground next to the helicopter, while maintenance crews worked frantically to repair battle damage and reload ammunition. Food consisted of sea rations eaten cold because there was no time to heat them. Water became the most precious commodity, and both door gunners drank constantly to replace fluid loss through sweat in the 100-degree heat. At 11:30 that night, after nearly 19 hours of continuous operations, the flight crews were finally released to rest. Patterson stumbled to his hooch and collapsed on his bunk without removing his boots. February 14, 1968 marked Patterson's 40th day of continuous combat operations, and the accumulated strain was beginning to show across the entire unit. The Tet Offensive had been repelled in most areas, but fighting continued, and the operational tempo remained punishing. The Undertakers had lost 3 helicopters completely destroyed, and 5 more so badly damaged they required extensive repairs. More significantly, they'd lost 7 crew members killed and 11 wounded seriously enough to be evacuated from Vietnam. Among the dead was Warrant Officer Thomas Blake. the pilot who'd first flown with Rodriguez back when the Texan was a new door gunner. Blake's helicopter had been shot down during a medical evacuation mission on February 8th near Cuchi. The entire crew died when the aircraft exploded after hitting the ground. Rodriguez took Blake's death hard, retreating into himself, speaking little, mechanically performing his duties but losing the spark that had made him such an effective teacher to newer crew members. The constant exposure to death and violence affected everyone differently. Some men became fatalistic, convinced they wouldn't survive their tours and therefore taking greater risks because caution seemed pointless. Others became obsessively careful, developing elaborate pre-flight rituals and superstitions. A few broke mentally, unable to continue flying combat missions and being quietly transferred to non-flight duties without official recognition that they'd reached their psychological limits. Patterson found himself somewhere in the middle, maintaining functionality through rigid adherence to routine and professional standards. He cleaned his weapon obsessively, performed his duties exactly as trained, and avoided thinking too deeply about the larger meaning of what they were doing. The philosophical questions about the war's purpose that had troubled him during training seemed irrelevant now. His world had narrowed to immediate concerns. Keep the aircraft safe, protect the crew, suppress enemy fire, get everyone home alive. The bond between door gunners and their regular crews became almost mystical. Patterson flew primarily with Hansen, Chen, and Washington, and the four men developed an almost telepathic ability to coordinate during combat. Hansen would begin a maneuver and Patterson would already be repositioning his weapon to cover the new angle of approach. Washington would spot a threat, and Patterson would engage it before the crew chief finished his warning over the intercom. This synchronization saved their lives repeatedly during February's constant combat. The military's personnel rotation system, however, disrupted crew continuity. Washington completed his tour on February 19th and flew home to Georgia. His replacement, Specialist Leonard Harris from Michigan, was competent but new to combat flying, and the crew had to rebuild their coordination from scratch. The process took weeks, and during that vulnerable period, they survived several close calls that Patterson believed Washington's experience would have prevented. Combat's physical toll was equally significant. Patterson lost 18 pounds during his first 2 months in Vietnam, despite eating whenever food was available. The heat, stress, and constant physical demands of the job burned calories faster than he could replace them. His hearing degraded despite ear protection, the constant exposure to weapon fire and engine noise causing permanent damage that would affect him for life. Small wounds accumulated, burns from hot brass ejecting from his M60, cuts from sharp metal edges inside the aircraft, bruises from being thrown against hard surfaces during violent maneuvers. The psychological cost was harder to quantify but perhaps more significant. Patterson stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours per night, usually waking from nightmares about being shot down or watching crew members die. He developed an almost paranoid awareness of his surroundings even when off-duty, constantly scanning for threats, unable to relax. Loud noises made him flinch. He avoided emotional attachments to new personnel because experience taught that many wouldn't survive long enough to become real friends. According to research published in military medical journals after the war, helicopter crew members in Vietnam experienced PTSD rates comparable to frontline infantry, sometimes higher because of the intensity and repetitive nature of their combat exposure. A door gunner could experience more combat in a single day than a ground soldier might see in a week, flying multiple missions into hot landing zones. March 17, 1968 brought Patterson face-to-face with the arbitrary cruelty of war during what should have been a routine medical evacuation. The mission began with a radio call from an infantry platoon operating northwest of Bien Hoa, reporting 3 wounded soldiers who needed immediate evacuation. The landing zone was described as cold, meaning no enemy contact expected, and the injuries were serious but not critical. Hansen's crew launched within 10 minutes, flying alone because the situation didn't warrant a full package with gunship escorts. The flight to the coordinates took 15 minutes, and everything appeared normal as they approached the landing zone, a small clearing near a village. The infantry platoon popped purple smoke to mark their position, and Hansen began his approach from the east. Patterson was scanning the tree line out of habit rather than because he expected danger when he saw the muzzle flash. A single shot from a sniper rifle struck Second Lieutenant Chen in the head, killing him instantly. The co-pilot slumped forward against his harness, and Hansen immediately pulled out of the approach, banking hard away from the sniper's position while calling for help. Patterson fired at where he'd seen the flash, knowing it was futile because the sniper would have already moved, but unable to do nothing. Chen had been 23 years old, engaged to be married and 2 months from completing his tour. He'd been good at his job, well liked by the enlisted crew members, and excited about returning home to California. One bullet from one sniper had ended all of that in an instant. The randomness of it shook Patterson more than the intense combat of the Tet Offensive had. During heavy fighting, death made a terrible kind of sense. Lots of bullets flying, odds were some would hit. But this was different. Chen died during a routine mission to save wounded soldiers, killed by a single shot before they'd even landed. The platoon eventually captured the sniper, a 16-year-old girl who'd fired one shot and tried to escape but couldn't run fast enough. The infantry soldiers wanted to execute her on the spot, but their lieutenant prevented it, and she was taken prisoner. Patterson learned this later and didn't know how to feel about it. Part of him wanted revenge for Chen's death. Part of him was horrified that a teenager had been put in position to kill and be killed. Mostly he felt numb, another piece of humanity scraped away by the war's relentless brutality. The unit held a memorial service for Chen 3 days later. Captain Hayes spoke about duty and sacrifice. The chaplain offered prayers. The remaining pilots from Chen's officer class shared stories. Patterson attended but found the ceremony hollow. Words couldn't capture what Chen's death meant or restore the sense of safety that his random killing had destroyed. If a bullet could find someone during a routine medevac, then nowhere was safe. No mission was truly secure, and survival was pure luck, rather than skill. New pilots and crew members continued arriving to replace casualties. The rotation system that brought fresh personnel to Vietnam every month ensured units maintained their strength, but prevented crews from developing the deep experience that might have improved survival rates. Patterson found himself becoming an experienced veteran by virtue of simply surviving 3 months, and new door gunners looked to him the way he'd looked to Rodriguez in those first terrifying days. He tried to pass on what he'd learned. Maintain your weapon religiously, stay hydrated, watch the tree lines constantly, communicate with your crew, don't freeze when contact starts, trust your instincts, keep firing even when you can't see targets because suppressive fire saves lives. But he knew that knowledge and training could only do so much. Ultimately, surviving as a door gunner came down to luck, and eventually everyone's luck ran out. November 20th, 1968. Patterson stood on the tarmac at Bien Hoa Air Base for the last time, watching the commercial airliner that would take him home to America. He'd survived his 12-month tour, beaten the odds, outlasted the statistics. Of the original crew he'd flown with in January, only Hansen remained. Washington had gone home in February. Chen had died in March. Harris, Washington's replacement, had been wounded in May and evacuated to Japan. The replacements who'd followed had their own stories of loss and survival. Patterson had flown 347 combat missions during his tour, fired approximately 60,000 rounds of ammunition, been in aircraft that took hits 73 times, survived 2 emergency landings after battle damage, and watched 4 helicopters from his unit be shot down with the loss of 14 crew members he'd known personally. He'd killed enemy soldiers, exactly how many he couldn't say, because door gunners rarely saw the results of their fire, but certainly dozens, possibly more. The statistic about 19 seconds of life expectancy had proven both true and false. True in the sense that those critical seconds during hot extractions and insertions were indeed the most dangerous moments a door gunner faced, when the helicopter was most vulnerable and exposure was total. False in the sense that many door gunners survived multiple such exposures through a combination of skill, crew coordination, and sheer luck. The average didn't capture the reality that some men died on their first mission while others, like Patterson, survived entire tours. According to military records compiled after the war, approximately 5,000 door gunners served in Vietnam, and casualty rates varied dramatically depending on unit, time period, and operational area. Some sources estimate that as many as 1/3 suffered wounds serious enough to require medical evacuation, though exact statistics remain difficult to verify because door gunners were grouped with other helicopter crew members in casualty reports rather than tracked as a separate category. The flight home took 20 hours with refueling stops in the Philippines and Hawaii. Patterson sat in his seat, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, watching America gradually come closer through the small window. The other soldiers on the flight were similarly quiet, each processing the transition from war zone to home in their own way. Some would successfully readjust to civilian life. Others would struggle with invisible wounds that wouldn't heal for years or decades. A few would never fully recover. Travis Air Force Base in California was the re-entry point to America. After landing, processing through customs and receiving orders for his next duty station took several hours. Then Patterson was simply a soldier again, released to travel home on leave before reporting to Fort Hood, Texas for his remaining time in service. No parade, no recognition, just a discharge of one more Vietnam veteran into a society that was increasingly conflicted about the war. The flight from California to Ohio gave Patterson time to think about what he would tell his family. His mother had worried constantly during his tour, evident in every letter she'd sent. His father, a Second World War veteran, would understand some of what Patterson had experienced, but not all. The wars were different. The reception at home was different, and the door gunner's unique role in Vietnam had no real precedent in earlier conflicts. Patterson had changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. He was 20 years old but felt decades older. He'd faced death repeatedly, killed other human beings, watched friends die, and done things he'd never imagined himself capable of doing. The teenager who'd left Ohio 12 months earlier no longer existed, replaced by someone harder, more cynical, carrying memories and experiences that couldn't be shared with people who hadn't been there. The door gunners who served in Vietnam would remain largely forgotten in the decades that followed, their specific sacrifices absorbed into the larger narrative of helicopter warfare, but rarely examined separately. Unlike pilots who received significant attention and recognition, or infantry soldiers whose ground combat experiences dominated popular understanding of the war, Dr. Gunners occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, too exposed and vulnerable to be considered support personnel, too mechanized and technical to fit traditional notions of infantry heroism, yet their contribution to the war effort was immeasurable. Door gunners protected every helicopter they flew on, saved countless lives through suppressive fire during extractions, enabled the air mobility tactics that defined American operations in Vietnam, and absorbed tremendous casualties while doing so. They were teenagers and young men, mostly, thrust into one of the war's most dangerous roles with minimal training, and expected to perform with professional skill during moments of extreme danger. Patterson arrived home in Cincinnati on November 23, 1968. His mother cried when she saw him. His father shook his hand and looked at him with understanding that needed no words. His younger brother asked excited questions about helicopters and combat that Patterson deflected with vague answers. That night, lying in his childhood bed, he listened to the silence of suburban Ohio and found it more disturbing than comforting. The door gunners of Vietnam would carry their experiences forward into the remainder of their lives, some openly, others silently. They would deal with physical injuries, hearing loss, and psychological wounds in an era when post-traumatic stress was poorly understood and inadequately treated. Many would struggle with employment, relationships, and the challenge of explaining their military service to people who increasingly viewed the Vietnam War as a mistake or tragedy, rather than a worthy cause. But they had served with courage and skill in one of the most dangerous combat roles in military history. And though America might forget the specifics of their sacrifice, those who flew with them never would. The pilots they protected, the soldiers they extracted from hot landing zones, the wounded they helped evacuate, all of them owed their lives to 19 and 20-year-old door gunners who'd sat in open doorways with nothing but a machine gun between them and the enemy, flying into fire again and again because the mission demanded it and their brothers in arms depended on them. Patterson would eventually speak publicly about his experiences decades later, when age and distance made the memories shareable in ways they hadn't been immediately after the war. He would participate in veterans organizations, return to Vietnam on healing journeys, and help educate younger generations about what door gunners had faced and accomplished. But on that night in November 1968, newly home from war, he simply lay awake and tried to remember who he'd been before Vietnam, knowing that person was gone forever, replaced by someone who'd seen and done too much to ever be that innocent again. The helicopter door gunners of Vietnam deserve remembrance not just as statistics or footnotes to the larger war, but as individuals who faced extraordinary danger with ordinary courage, day after day, mission after mission, until their tours ended or their luck ran out.